January 15th, 1974, 4:03 a.m., Wichita, Kansas. The street is silent. Snow settles softly along quiet sidewalks. Porch lights glow against the darkness of an ordinary suburban neighborhood. Inside nearby homes, families sleep peacefully, unaware that history is about to change forever. Nothing feels dangerous. Nothing feels unusual. And yet, at this exact moment, a man waits outside a house he has already studied for weeks. He is not rushing. He is not angry. He is calm. Because in his mind, this moment has already happened many times before. Tonight, imagination becomes reality. Investigators would later struggle with one haunting realization. The man responsible did not look like a monster. He looked normal. Dennis Rader was not driven by sudden rage or visible instability. He represented something far more unsettling. Organized violence shaped by patience, planning, and psychological control. For Rader, crime was not chaos. It was structure, a system, a carefully designed performance. And understanding that mindset became key to understanding how the BTK Killer operated undetected for decades. By all outward appearances, Dennis Rader lived an ordinary American life. He worked steady jobs, he attended church regularly, he raised a family. Neighbors described him as polite, quiet, dependable. The kind of man who followed rules. The kind of man no one feared. But psychologists later suggested that beneath this routine lived a powerful internal contradiction. Rader struggled with anonymity. He felt invisible, unnoticed. For some individuals, that feeling becomes motivation for success. For others, it becomes obsession with recognition. Rader wanted control, not just over situations, but over how he was perceived. And slowly, fantasy became the place where that control existed. Long before the murders began, Rader developed elaborate internal scenarios centered on domination and power. He later referred to these fantasies as projects. That word disturbed investigators because it removed emotion from violence. It transformed human beings into objectives. Psychologists describe this phase as fantasy reinforcement. When imagination grows stronger, each time it is rehearsed mentally. The mind begins testing possibilities, rehearsing outcomes, blurring the boundary between thought and action. Rader studied routines, watched neighborhoods, memorized patterns of daily life. Preparation itself became rewarding, and eventually, fantasy demanded execution. In the early morning darkness of Wichita, Rader approached his chosen target. Every movement was deliberate, every step rehearsed. Inside the home, ordinary life continued unaware. Children asleep, morning routines waiting to begin, the fragile normalcy of everyday existence. What happened next would shock an entire city. But the most chilling detail came afterward. Dennis Rader returned to normal life. He went to work, spoke casually with co-workers, blended seamlessly back into society. This psychological separation, known as compartmentalization, allowed him to maintain two identities simultaneously. Family man, killer, neither identity interfering with the other. Soon, Rader sought something beyond control. He wanted recognition. Letters began arriving at newspapers and police stations, typed messages filled with disturbing detail. The writer introduced himself with 3 letters that would terrorize Wichita for decades. BTK, bind, torture, kill. The name was intentional. Branding. Rader wasn't only committing crimes, he was constructing a narrative where he controlled fear itself. Each communication revealed a psychological need, not merely to evade capture, but to be intellectually acknowledged. He corrected investigators, critiqued media coverage, studied law enforcement responses. The killer was analyzing the investigation as carefully as investigators analyzed him. For years, police searched for someone unstable, someone violent, someone visibly dangerous. Instead, Dennis Rader became increasingly embedded within his community. He served as a church leader, worked as a compliance officer, enforcing regulations, advised neighbors on security measures. The man warning others about safety was the very person they feared. And that irony protected him. Because evil rarely appears extraordinary. Sometimes it hides behind routine, behind normal conversation, behind a familiar smile. Then, silence. Years passed. The BTK killer disappeared. The case grew cold. Technology at the time could not keep pace with an offender who understood patience. Rader aged, life continued. But internally, psychologists believe another conflict emerged. The fear of being forgotten. Recognition had become part of his identity. Without attention, the narrative lost meaning. And after nearly 3 decades, BTK returned. In 2004, new letters arrived. The killer reintroduced himself to the world. Investigators immediately noticed something different. Confidence, almost arrogance. BTK appeared convinced he still controlled the game. But investigations had evolved. Digital technology now preserved details invisible to human memory. During communication with authorities, Rader asked a question that would change everything. Could a computer disk be traced? Police answered carefully. No. It was a strategic deception, and BTK believed it, because he believed he understood how investigators thought. Days later, he sent the disk. Hidden inside the file was metadata, linking it to a church computer. The church led directly to Dennis Rader. Suddenly, decades of mystery collapsed into clarity. Investigators began silent surveillance. They watched his routines, his drives, his daily life. Everything looked ordinary. And that normality made the discovery even more terrifying. The monster investigators had imagined never existed. Instead, they found the quiet man next door. Authorities moved slowly, patiently. They understood that confronting Rader too soon could risk losing control of the situation. So they waited, gathered evidence, built certainty. Meanwhile, Rader continued living his routine, unaware that the psychological balance had shifted. The hunter had become the hunted. But analysts noticed something unsettling. His communications were increasing, more frequent, more daring, almost as if part of him wanted the story to end. Which raised one final question investigators could not ignore. Was Dennis Rader trying to escape capture or orchestrate his own discovery? Because sometimes the ultimate form of control is not avoiding attention. It is choosing the moment the world finally looks at you. And as authorities prepared to make their move, one uncertainty remained. How would a man obsessed with control react when control disappeared? The answer would arrive with a knock at a suburban door. A moment that would expose not only a killer, but the psychology behind decades of hidden terror. February 25th, 2005, Park City, Kansas. 12:40 p.m. The neighborhood looks exactly the way it always has. Trimmed lawns, quiet streets, mailboxes lined neatly along the road. Nothing suggests that one of the longest manhunts in American history is about to end. Inside a modest suburban home, Dennis Rader prepares for another ordinary afternoon. He checks paperwork, adjusts routine tasks, moves through familiar habits shaped by decades of discipline. Outside, unmarked vehicles begin to arrive. Detectives sit silently behind tinted windows. No sirens, no urgency, only patience. Because investigators now believe they understand something essential about BTK. Control was everything, and removing it required precision. For months, authorities had watched Rader carefully. They tracked movements, recorded routines, studied behavior the same way he once studied victims. The irony was impossible to ignore. The man who analyzed investigations for decades was now the subject of one. Behavioral analysts noted something unusual. Rader did not appear anxious. No signs of panic, no attempt to flee. Psychologists later suggested he felt safe, protected by years of success. Confidence had become psychological armor. He believed he understood law enforcement better than they understood him. And that belief would become his final vulnerability. At 12:58 p.m., police vehicles moved in. Officers approached calmly. A traffic stop was initiated near his home. Dennis Rader pulled over without resistance. When officers ordered him out of the vehicle, witnesses later described confusion on his face. Not fear. Confusion. As if reality had suddenly violated an internal script. Handcuffs closed around his wrists. The quiet man next door had finally been identified as BTK, but investigators noticed something unsettling. He remained calm, almost relieved. The interrogation room was small, neutral, carefully controlled. Detectives expected denial, silence, resistance. Instead, Dennis Rader began talking, almost immediately, calmly, methodically. He described events with chilling detachment, not emotional recollections, not apologies, descriptions, step-by-step explanations delivered like a lecture. Psychologists observing the interview recognized a critical shift. For decades, Rader controlled the narrative through secrecy. Now, control came through confession. He corrected investigators when details were inaccurate, clarified timelines, explained motivations. The interrogation became less an extraction of truth and more a performance. BTK was finally receiving the audience he had always wanted. Experts later argued that Rader's confession revealed his deepest psychological drive: recognition. He wanted investigators to understand how intelligent he had been, how organized, how careful. Each answer reinforced identity. He was no longer invisible. He was significant. This phenomenon is known as narcissistic supply, when acknowledgement becomes more valuable than freedom itself. And as questioning continued, detectives realized something chilling. Rader wasn't simply admitting guilt, he was reliving control. News spread rapidly across Wichita. Neighbors watched television in disbelief. Co-workers stared at mugshots. Church members struggled to reconcile memory with reality. The man who enforced city ordinances, led community prayers, smiled politely at neighborhood gatherings, was BTK. Psychologically, this moment shattered the illusion people rely on for safety. The belief that danger looks different from normal life. But investigators faced another unsettling realization. Rader showed little emotional conflict, no visible remorse, no psychological breakdown. Instead, he appeared composed, almost satisfied, because the story he had written for decades had reached its climax. June 27th, 2005. The courtroom filled with families, reporters, and investigators who had spent years chasing a ghost. Dennis Rader stood before them, and once again, he spoke calmly. Clinical language replaced emotion. He described crimes as if presenting research findings. No raised voice, no hesitation, just methodical narration. Observers struggled to understand how someone could recount devastating acts with such emotional distance. Psychologists later explained, Rader had separated identity from empathy long ago. To him, events existed as accomplishments, evidence of control achieved. But something unexpected began to emerge during proceedings. A subtle shift, without secrecy, without mystery, without the hidden identity. BTK no longer controlled the narrative. The world now defined him, and control was slipping away. For the first time in decades, Dennis Rader faced structure he could not manipulate. Prison routines replaced personal routines. Schedules imposed externally, decisions made by others. Behavioral experts observed that offenders, driven by control, often experience psychological destabilization once autonomy disappears. The game was over, and yet, investigators noticed something troubling. Rader continued writing letters, continuing communication, continuing storytelling. Even in confinement, the need for narrative remained alive, because control, once tasted, rarely disappears completely. Years after sentencing, analysts revisiting the case began asking a deeper question. Was BTK truly finished? Or had capture simply transformed his method of influence? Letters surfaced, drawings appeared. Attempts to maintain psychological presence beyond prison walls. Some experts suggested Rader's identity was never dependent on freedom, only on attention, which raises a disturbing possibility. Perhaps capture was never the end of the story. Perhaps it was another chapter. Because recent examinations of his writings revealed patterns investigators had not fully understood before. References, symbols, ideas suggesting unfinished psychological narratives. Hints that the BTK mindset extended beyond the crimes themselves. And as researchers began reanalyzing decades of material, one chilling theory emerged. What if Dennis Rader wasn't only documenting his past, but leaving clues about how he wanted to be remembered in the future? A legacy carefully constructed, a final attempt at control, and hidden within those writings may lie the most disturbing revelation yet. Not about what BTK did, but about what he believed he became. If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe to Inside Criminal Mind Stories, because the psychology only gets darker.